The Zetherian ships appeared in Earth's orbit on a Tuesday morning without warning. They were massive vessels that blocked out the sun over major cities, and their arrival sent every government on the planet into emergency sessions. The aliens made contact within hours, and their message was direct and simple. Earth now belonged to the Zetherian Empire, and humanity would serve as the newest addition to their labor force. They had done this 47 times before on 47 different worlds, and they expected this to go exactly the same way. Commander Vexthor led the delegation that landed at the United Nations building in New York. He was a tall, insectoid creature with 4 arms and compound eyes that reflected light in unsettling ways. His translator device rendered his clicking speech into perfect English as he addressed the gathered world leaders. President Margaret Sullivan sat at the head of the table with her cabinet members and representatives from every major nation. They listened as Vexthor explained the new order with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no. The work schedule was simple, according to Zetherian standards. Humans would work for 12 hours, then rest for 6 hours, then work for 12 more hours. This cycle would repeat every day without variation. There would be no weekends and no holidays and no exceptions. The Zetherians had refined this system over 3,000 years, and it had proven efficient across every species they had encountered. Vexthor explained that resistance was pointless because they had superior technology and overwhelming military force. He gave humanity 72 hours to begin compliance. What Vexthor did not understand was that he had just told a species that invented the concept of the all-nighter that they were not allowed to rest enough. He had told a species that created energy drinks with warning labels that they needed to work more. He had told a species whose entire industrial revolution was built on people working themselves to exhaustion that they had a mandatory rest period. The humans in that room looked at each other with expressions the Zetherian commander could not read. President Sullivan asked politely if there was room for negotiation. Vexthor responded that negotiation implied equality, and humans were now subjects of the Empire. She thanked him for his time, and the meeting ended. The Zetherians left confident that they would receive surrender within the deadline. They had never been more wrong about anything in their entire history as a species captain. Danny Morrison received the stand-down order while his carrier group was conducting exercises in the Pacific Ocean. The message from command was clear: accept the alien occupation and return to port for reassignment under Zetherian authority. Morrison read the order 3 times, then walked out onto the deck of his ship. His crew had been at sea for 6 months straight running, on coffee and determination, and the idea of telling them to just give up made him laugh out loud. He called his senior officers to the bridge and showed them the order. Lieutenant Sophie Blake, who served as his tactical officer, raised an eyebrow and asked if he was actually considering compliance. Morrison grinned and asked her what she thought. Blake pointed out that their ammunition stores were full, and their aircraft were fueled, and their crew was already used to operating on 3 hours of sleep. She suggested they might as well keep doing what they were doing until someone physically stopped them. Morrison sent a response to command that was polite but firm. He acknowledged receipt of the order and respectfully declined to follow it. His battle group would remain on station and continue operations. If the aliens wanted his ships, they would have to come take them. He signed off and turned to his crew and told them to prepare for combat operations. Nobody questioned the decision and nobody suggested surrender. They just got back to work. The Zetherians monitored these communications and assumed it was an isolated case of one rogue commander. They were certain the human government would handle the situation internally. They did not understand that Morrison's response was being repeated across every branch of every military on the planet. Soldiers and sailors and pilots were receiving stand-down orders and responding with variations of the same message. Thanks, but no thanks, and come make us if you can. In Colorado, a squadron commander named Linda Hayes told her pilots to fuel up because they had work to do. In Germany, a tank battalion led by Colonel Peter Graf started running drills instead of standing down. In Japan, a naval captain named Kenneth Sato took his destroyer group out to sea rather than return to port. The pattern repeated across the globe, and the Zetherians watched in confusion as their standard occupation protocol fell apart before it even started. Vexthor reported back to the Empire that there seemed to be a communication problem. The human leadership had clearly failed to properly convey the surrender order to their military forces. The Empire responded by sending technical advisors to help establish proper control. These advisors arrived expecting to work with a compliant government. Instead, they found President Sullivan in the White House Situation Room, coordinating with military commanders who had no intention of stopping. One of the Zetherian advisors asked Sullivan directly why she had not ordered her forces to stand down. She explained that she had in fact issued the order exactly as requested. The advisor asked why the military was not following orders. Sullivan smiled and said that was an excellent question, and that she had been asking herself the same thing. The advisor did not understand that the president was lying and that every order to stand down had included coded authorization to ignore the stand down. The 72-hour deadline passed and Earth had not surrendered. The Zetherians had expected mass compliance and peaceful transition. Instead, they found a planet full of humans who were still going to work and still operating their military forces, and generally acting like the invasion had not even happened. Vexthor called another meeting with human leadership and demanded an explanation. Margaret Sullivan sat across from the alien commander and explained it as simply as she could. Humans did not respond well to demands. Humans did not like being told what to do. Humans had a long history of fighting against overwhelming odds, just because someone said they could not win. She suggested that perhaps the Zetherians had made a mistake in their approach. Vexthor responded that force would be applied until compliance was achieved. Sullivan nodded and said that was certainly one option, but it probably would not work out the way he expected. The meeting ended and both sides prepared for what came next. The Zetherians prepared their invasion fleet for a standard pacification operation. The humans prepared for war in the way humans always had throughout their entire violent history. They grabbed whatever weapons they could find and started figuring out how to hurt something bigger than themselves. The galaxy was about to learn why humanity had survived every extinction event their planet had thrown at them. They simply did not know when to quit. The Zetherian invasion fleet arrived in force 3 days after the failed deadline. 200 warships took positions over major population centers and began their standard occupation procedure. They disabled power grids with electromagnetic pulses and knocked out satellite communications and destroyed key infrastructure targets. The plan was proven and efficient and had worked on every previous world. Within 72 hours, the population would be desperate and disorganized and ready to accept any terms just to get their basic services restored. 72 hours later, Lieutenant Sophie Blake was leading a resistance cell through the ruins of downtown Chicago, using hand-drawn maps and runners on bicycles. The power was still out and the phone still did not work, and none of that seemed to matter much. A retired postal worker named George Martinez had organized a supply chain, using the old mail routes, and was moving food and ammunition through the city faster than the aliens could track. They had figured out that Zetherian patrols followed precise schedules and never deviated from their patterns. Blake's team hit 3 supply depots in one night using nothing but timing and conventional weapons. The aliens had shields that stopped energy weapons and high-tech explosives, but apparently nobody had told the shields about regular bullets. A hunting rifle fired from a good position could punch right through the energy barriers, and the Zetherians were learning this lesson the hard way. Blake reported back to what remained of the military command structure that the enemy was vulnerable and predictable, and that her people had no intention of stopping. In Tokyo, a university, professor named Kenneth Yamamoto was working in his chemistry lab on his 4th straight day without sleep. He had gotten his hands on a Zetherian scanner that had been pulled from a destroyed drone, and he was taking it apart piece by piece. The technology was advanced but not impossible to understand, and Yamamoto had always been good at figuring out how things worked. By the end of day 5, he had built a jammer that could blind the alien sensors for short periods. By the end of day 6, he was mass-producing them in his lab with help from his students. The Zetherians tried their next standard tactic, which was cutting off food supplies to the major cities. This had always worked before because conquered populations could not feed themselves without their infrastructure. Earth was different because Earth had farmers who did not need permission to grow food. In Nebraska, a farming cooperative led by Linda Peterson responded to the blockade by raiding an alien supply depot and stealing an entire harvester ship. They flew it back to their fields and started using it to plow because, as Peterson explained, it was better than their old equipment, and the aliens were not using it anyway. Commander Vexthor watched the reports coming in from occupation forces and could not understand what he was seeing. Humans were supposed to be desperate by now. They were supposed to be begging for their power and communications to be restored. Instead, they were adapting and organizing and fighting back with primitive weapons that should not have been effective. He sent a message to the Empire explaining that there seemed to be a malfunction in human psychology. The Empire responded by sending reinforcements and ordering him to increase pressure on the population. The aliens began destroying food storage facilities and water treatment plants. This had always broken resistance on other worlds within days. On Earth, it just made humans angry. In California, a desalination plant operator named Chris Anderson watched the aliens destroy his facility, then immediately started building a new one, using salvaged parts and solar panels. He had it running in under a week. When the aliens destroyed that one, he built another. When they destroyed the third one, he built a fourth and added defensive positions. A Zetherian officer asked his human prisoner why they kept rebuilding things that would just be destroyed again. The prisoner was a construction worker named Paul Stevens, who had been caught trying to repair a bridge. Stevens explained that humans were really good at building things and also really stubborn about fixing things that broke. The officer asked when the humans would accept that they had lost. Stevens laughed and said they were nowhere near losing yet. The officer reported this conversation as evidence of a species-wide mental disorder. Month 3 of the occupation saw the Zetherians controlling the air and space around Earth but losing ground everywhere else. Human resistance fighters had figured out how to make the cities unusable for alien patrols. They booby-trapped buildings and created ambush zones and generally made every block a potential combat area. The aliens had superior technology, but humans had home field advantage and centuries of experience in urban warfare. In Boston, a firefighter named Rachel Moore was leading a team that specialized in hit-and-run attacks on alien supply lines. They would strike fast and disappear into the subway tunnels before the Zetherians could respond. Moore had not slept more than 3 hours a night since the invasion started, and she had no plans to change that. Her team operated on coffee and energy drinks and pure spite. When asked by a reporter how long she could keep it up, Moore said she would let them know when she found her limit. The Zetherian military command held an emergency meeting to discuss the Earth situation. Every other conquest had been completed within 6 months. Earth was approaching month 4 and showed no signs of surrender. Their forces were stretched thin, trying to control a population that refused to be controlled. Supply lines were constantly under attack. Patrols were being ambushed daily. Infrastructure that they destroyed was being rebuilt or replaced with improvised alternatives. A Zetherian psychologist named Krenal presented research on human biology and behavior. The findings were disturbing. Humans had no biological mechanism that forced them to stop when exhausted. They could override their own survival instincts through willpower alone. They had evolved as persistence hunters who would chase prey for days until it collapsed. That same trait applied to everything they did. They would keep going until their bodies physically failed, and even then they would often try to continue. Krenal showed historical examples that horrified the military command. Humans had fought wars that lasted 30 years and 100 years. They had explored places that should have killed them just to see what was there. They had invented extreme sports as entertainment. One human had apparently run over 100 miles without stopping just to prove it could be done. The species was fundamentally broken according to every Zetherian psychological model. The military command asked Krenal how to make humans stop fighting. The psychologist reviewed all the data and gave an answer that nobody wanted to hear. You cannot make them stop. You can kill them, but you cannot make them quit. Every standard pacification technique assumed the enemy had a breaking point. Humans did not appear to have one. They would lose every battle and still show up for the next one. They would run out of ammunition and switch to improvised weapons. They would be outnumbered and outgunned and still attack. Commander Vexthor asked what the Empire should do. Krenal suggested they had 3 options. Exterminate humanity completely, which would require destroying the entire planet. Withdraw and admit defeat, which was unthinkable for the Empire. Or find some way to negotiate, which had never been done before. The command dismissed the meeting without making a decision, and the war continued. On Earth, humans kept doing what they did best. They kept fighting and adapting and refusing to accept their situation. The Zetherians had expected to conquer a primitive species. Instead, they had started a war with an enemy that did not understand the concept of surrender. Both sides were learning that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who does not know when they are beaten. The war entered its 6th month, and the Zetherian Empire was facing something it had never encountered in 3,000 years of conquest. They were facing an enemy that refused to acknowledge basic military reality. On paper, Earth should have fallen within weeks. The aliens controlled orbital space and had technology centuries ahead of human capabilities, and possessed enough firepower to level continents. None of that seemed to matter because humans kept fighting anyway. The pattern repeated across every continent and every city. When humans ran out of missiles, they switched to conventional artillery. When the artillery ran out, they used rifles and homemade explosives. When those ran low, a mechanic named Jake Collins drove a bulldozer straight into an alien walker because he figured the machine was heavy enough to do damage. He was right, and the walker collapsed and Collins walked away without a scratch. The incident was caught on camera and became a rallying cry for resistance fighters everywhere. Commander Vex Thor requested another meeting with human leadership to discuss terms of surrender. President Margaret Sullivan agreed to meet, but brought military advisors who looked like they had not slept in days. Vex Thor explained that continued resistance was pointless, and that human casualties were mounting and that Earth's infrastructure was being destroyed. He asked when Sullivan planned to order a general surrender to prevent further loss of life. Sullivan looked at the alien commander with an expression he still could not read and explained that surrender was not really in her authority to order. Vex Thor stated that she was the planetary leader and of course she had that authority. Sullivan smiled and said that humans did not really work that way. She could give the order, but there was no guarantee anyone would follow it. Soldiers and civilians were fighting because they chose to fight, and they would stop when they chose to stop. Vex Thor asked when that would be, and Sullivan said probably never. The Zetherian military psychologist Kreenal was assigned to study captured human fighters to understand their decision-making process. The first subject was Colonel Patricia Hughes, who had been captured after defending a field hospital for 16 straight hours. She had a broken leg and 3 cracked ribs and had been separated from her unit for the last 6 hours of the fight. Kreenal asked her why she had not surrendered when injured and alone. Hughes looked at the psychologist like the question did not make sense. She explained that there were patients in that hospital who could not be moved, and surrendering meant those patients would die. Kreenal pointed out that her continued resistance was futile, and that she was guaranteed to lose. Hughes shrugged and said that losing was only guaranteed if you stopped trying. As long as she kept fighting, there was a chance, however small. Kreenal asked when she would have stopped fighting, and Hughes said probably when she passed out from blood loss. The psychologist interviewed dozens of captured humans and received similar answers from all of them. A pilot named Scott Martinez had ejected from his damaged aircraft and continued calling in strikes while hiding behind enemy lines for 3 days. A medic named Amy Richardson had treated wounded fighters in a collapsed building while under fire for 11 hours. A teenager named Billy Carson had thrown rocks at alien patrols because he did not have any real weapons. None of them could explain exactly why they had not given up. They just had not considered it as an option. Kreenal compiled a report that disturbed the entire Zetherian command structure. Humans did not have a psychological breaking point in the way other species did. They could watch their forces be destroyed, and their cities burned, and their situation become hopeless and still choose to continue fighting. It was not courage or bravery in the traditional sense. It was something more fundamental. Humans simply did not have an internal mechanism that told them to quit. The psychologist included historical data that made the situation worse. Humans had fought a war that lasted 100 years over a succession dispute. They had fought another war in trenches for 4 years that killed millions and gained almost no territory for either side. They had explored both poles of their planet just to say they had done it. They had climbed the highest mountains and crossed the widest oceans and dived to the deepest parts of the sea. When asked why they did these things, the answer was always some variation of, because it was there. Kreenal presented the most disturbing finding last. Humans had invented the concept of extreme sports. They jumped out of aircraft for fun. They threw themselves off bridges attached to elastic cords. They rode down mountains on small boards at high speed. They fought each other in cages as entertainment. A species that did these things for recreation was not going to stop fighting just because the odds were bad. Bad odds were apparently something humans enjoyed. The Empire held an emergency council session to decide what to do about Earth. The military recommended increasing force to break human resistance through overwhelming firepower. The diplomatic corps suggested that perhaps conquest was not viable and withdrawal should be considered. The scientific advisors proposed studying humans more carefully to find a weakness. The Council could not reach agreement and the war continued. On Earth, the resistance adapted and evolved. A network engineer named Gary Foster figured out how to create a communication system using old radio equipment and improvised relays. Within 2 weeks, humans had better intelligence about alien movements than the aliens had about human activities. A high school chemistry teacher named Susan Bell started producing explosives in her garage and distributing them through the resistance network. When the aliens raided her house, she moved operations to an abandoned warehouse and kept going. The Zetherians tried a new approach and targeted human morale by destroying cultural sites and historical monuments. This had worked on other species who valued their history. Humans responded by getting angry and fighting harder. When the aliens destroyed the Statue of Liberty, a construction crew led by Tony Russo started building a new one out of scrap metal. When aliens destroyed that one, Russo built another. He was on his 4th version when the aliens gave up and stopped targeting it. Month 7 brought a realization to the Zetherian command that they did not want to accept. They were not winning. They held territory but could not pacify it. They destroyed infrastructure, but humans just built new infrastructure. They killed resistance fighters, but new fighters appeared to replace them. Every metric suggested they were dominant, but the actual situation on the ground told a different story. They were stuck in an endless grinding conflict with an enemy that had infinite patience. Commander Vexthor received orders from the Empire to demonstrate ultimate power. They would destroy one major city completely as an example. Surely that would break human resistance and force surrender. The commander selected Singapore and gave a 48-hour warning to allow evacuation. He expected the human government to beg for mercy. Instead, he watched as humans evacuated civilians while simultaneously moving military assets into the city. They were going to defend it even knowing it would be destroyed. A structural engineer named Peter Wong led a team that attempted something insane. They gathered every piece of alien technology they had captured and combined it with human engineering in an attempt to build a defensive shield. The project had a success rate that Wong estimated at maybe 5%. His team worked around the clock anyway, using 300 car batteries and components from 6 different alien systems. Nobody thought it would work, but nobody suggested they should not try. The attack on Singapore came exactly on schedule. Zetherian warships unleashed enough firepower to level the entire city. Wong's impossible shield activated and held for 17 minutes before collapsing. 17 minutes was enough time to evacuate thousands more people than the original estimates. The city was destroyed, but human engineers had literally built a functional shield generator from spare parts and sheer determination. The Zetherians had proven they could destroy a city. The humans had proven they would try to save it even when the math said it was impossible. Both sides prepared for the next phase of the war. The Zetherians were learning that victory against humans was not measured in battles won. The humans were learning that they could survive things that should kill them. Neither side was ready to quit, and the galaxy watched to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object that refused to move. The destruction of Singapore changed something in the war, but not in the way the Zetherian Empire expected. They thought the display of overwhelming power would break human resistance. Instead, it crystallized human determination into something harder and more focused. The ruins of Singapore became a symbol not of defeat but of defiance. Peter Wong survived the attack and immediately started working on Shield version 2 with improvements, based on what he learned from the first attempt. Commander Vexthor watched the aftermath, reports with growing confusion. Human forces had not collapsed after Singapore. They had reorganized and reinforced their positions everywhere else. Civilian populations had not panicked and demanded surrender. They had donated more resources to the resistance and volunteered in greater numbers. The Zetherian strategy was based on breaking enemy morale through demonstrations of power. Human morale appeared to work backwards from every other species they had encountered. The war entered month 8, and both sides were exhausted. Zetherian forces were stretched across the entire planet, trying to maintain control of territory they technically held, but could not actually pacify. Human forces were running on fumes and improvised supplies but showed no signs of slowing down. The stalemate was costing both sides resources they could not afford to lose. Something had to change, but neither side knew what. Admiral Lisa Chang commanded what remained of the Pacific Fleet, from a carrier that had been operating continuously for 8 months. Her ships were held together with improvised repairs, and her crew was running on willpower and terrible coffee. She made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She opened a direct communication channel to the nearest Zetherian command ship, and instead of issuing threats or demands, she asked a simple question: "Why are you really here?" The Zetherian commander who received the message was caught off guard. Nobody had ever asked that question before. Conquered species usually asked how to surrender or begged for mercy, or issued pointless threats. This human admiral was asking about motivation. The commander almost ignored the message, but something made him respond. He was tired and the war was going nowhere, and maybe talking would achieve something that fighting had not. Commander Vexthor agreed to a direct conversation with Admiral Chang. They met via video link with no other personnel present. Chang asked her question again, and this time Vexthor actually answered honestly. The Zetherian Empire was declining. Their rigid society had become stagnant. Their people needed 12 hours of rest per cycle, and their productivity was dropping. They conquered other species to do the work that Zetherians could no longer sustain themselves. It was about survival, not cruelty. Chang listened without interrupting and then asked why they had not simply asked for help instead of invading. Vexthor paused for a long moment. The question had never occurred to him. Zetherian culture was built on hierarchy and dominance. You were either the conqueror or the conquered. The concept of cooperation between equal species did not exist in their framework. Chang pointed out that humans cooperated with each other all the time, despite being from different nations and cultures. Maybe that approach would work better than war. The conversation lasted 3 hours and covered topics neither of them expected to discuss. Vexthor explained that the Empire was facing problems beyond just labor shortages. Their rigid scheduling and resistance to change meant they could not adapt to new challenges. Chang explained that humans were very good at adaptation because they had no choice. Earth had thrown everything at humanity, from ice ages to plagues, and humans survived by being flexible and stubborn. She suggested that maybe the two species had things to learn from each other. Vexthor asked what Chang was proposing. She said a ceasefire to start. No more attacks from either side. Then negotiations to see if there was a way forward that did not involve endless war. The commander pointed out that the Empire would never accept surrender. Chang smiled and said she was not offering surrender. She was offering an alternative. The Zetherians could keep fighting a war they could not win, or they could try something new. Vexthor said he would take the proposal to his superiors. The ceasefire began 72 hours later, and held despite skepticism from both sides. Human forces maintained defensive positions ready to resume fighting at any moment. Zetherian forces did the same. Nobody trusted the peace, but nobody broke it either. President Margaret Sullivan assembled a diplomatic team to begin formal negotiations. The team included military officers and scientists and engineers and civilian advisors. Their instructions were simple. Find out what the aliens actually need and see if we can work something out. The first negotiation session was tense. Zetherian diplomats expected humans to offer conditional surrender. Human diplomats arrived with proposals for trade agreements and technology exchanges and mutual defense pacts. The Zetherians did not understand. They had invaded Earth, they had killed thousands of humans. Why were humans offering cooperation instead of demanding revenge? Ambassador Andrew Foster explained that holding grudges was not productive and that humans were more interested in practical solutions than emotional satisfaction. The negotiations revealed the depth of Zetherian problems. Their empire was built on conquest, but they were running out of species to conquer. Their rigid work schedules were killing productivity. Their refusal to adapt meant they were falling behind in technology development. They needed help, but their culture had no mechanism for asking for it. Foster suggested that perhaps humans could provide workers on a voluntary basis in exchange for technology and resources. The Zetherians could not comprehend the concept of voluntary labor. A human engineer named Carlos Rodriguez was sent to a Zetherian mining colony as a demonstration. The colony was failing because Zetherian workers could not maintain the 12-hour work schedule in the harsh conditions. Rodriguez arrived and immediately started changing things. He introduced shift rotations where workers actually got adequate rest. He reorganized the workflow to be more efficient. He trained the Zetherian workers on maintenance procedures they had never learned. Within 3 weeks, production increased by 40%, and worker injuries dropped to almost zero. The Zetherian colony administrator reported these results to the Empire with confusion. One human had achieved more improvement than years of standard Zetherian management. Rodriguez explained that he had not done anything special. He had just applied basic principles of ergonomics and worker safety that humans had figured out over centuries of industrial development. The administrator asked why Zetherians had never discovered these principles. Rodriguez suggested that maybe having a rigid, unchanging culture made it hard to learn new things. More human specialists were sent to Zetherian facilities as test cases. Dr. Helen Park went to a medical station and revolutionized their patient care by introducing the radical concept that rest actually helped healing. The Zetherian doctors had been so focused on efficiency that they never considered that forcing patients to remain active might slow recovery. Park's methods cut average hospital stays in half. She wrote a manual on basic medical care that Zetherian physicians studied like it was sacred text. The cultural exchange went both ways. Humans learned Zetherian approaches to resource management and long-term planning. The aliens thought in terms of centuries where humans usually thought in terms of years or decades. Zetherian materials science was centuries ahead of human capabilities. Their mathematics was more advanced. Their understanding of physics opened new possibilities. Human scientists absorbed everything they could learn and immediately started thinking of applications the Zetherians had never considered. Month 10 of the ceasefire brought an unexpected crisis. Zetherian scientists shared data about a cosmic anomaly approaching their territory. Several colony worlds would be destroyed within a decade. Their best minds had concluded there was no solution. The math showed it was impossible to divert or stop. They shared this information as context for why the Empire had become desperate enough to accelerate their conquest program. They needed more resources and workers to evacuate those worlds. Ambassador Foster listened to the presentation and asked to see all the data. The Zetherian scientists provided everything. Foster took it back to Earth's top physicists and engineers. Within a week, the human response came back. The Zetherians had concluded it was impossible, but humans wanted to try anyway. A team led by astrophysicist Gregory Bennett requested permission to work directly with Zetherian scientists on the problem. The Empire agreed mostly because they had nothing to lose. The joint research team started working and immediately ran into cultural problems. Zetherian scientists worked in rigid hierarchies and followed established procedures. Human scientists brainstormed and argued and tried wild ideas just to see what happened. Bennett had to explain the concept of constructive disagreement to his Zetherian counterpart Thalrex, who thought arguing with superiors was forbidden. Bennett said that arguing was how humans figured out whose ideas were actually good. Thalrex found this disturbing but agreed to try it. The team worked for months and failed repeatedly. Every approach hit mathematical or physical barriers that seemed insurmountable. The Zetherians became discouraged. The humans got more energized with each failure, because each failure taught them something new. Bennett explained that Thomas Edison had famously failed thousands of times before inventing a working light bulb. Thalrex asked why anyone would continue after so many failures. Bennett said because eventually you stop finding ways that do not work and find one that does. On day 147 of joint research, the team found something. A possibility so remote that Zetherian probability calculations dismissed it as impossible. The humans wanted to try it anyway. The idea involved building a network of gravity tethers using both human and Zetherian technology to redirect the cosmic anomaly. It would require resources from both civilizations and construction in deep space and work crews operating in lethal conditions for extended periods. The math said it had maybe a 12% chance of success. Gregory Bennett presented the plan to both governments and recommended they attempt it. The Zetherian Council asked why they should waste resources on a plan that would probably fail. Bennett pointed out that probably failing was better than definitely failing, which was their current situation. President Sullivan approved Earth's participation immediately. The Zetherian Empire debated for 2 weeks before agreeing. Both sides began mobilizing resources for an attempt that most expected would not work, but everyone agreed was worth trying. The Gravity Tether Project became the largest joint construction effort in Zetherian history, and the most ambitious thing humans had ever attempted in space. Both species contributed resources and personnel and technology. The project required 300 construction teams working simultaneously in deep space, under conditions that would kill anyone who made a mistake. The Zetherians brought precision engineering and advanced materials. The humans brought improvisation and a willingness to try things that had never been tested. Construction Chief Maria Santos led the human teams with a management style that confused her Zetherian counterparts. She encouraged workers to suggest improvements and question designs and try alternative approaches. The Zetherian construction lead insisted on following the approved plans exactly. Santos explained that plans were guidelines and reality always required adjustments. The first time a human crew solved a critical problem by ignoring the official procedure and doing something that just made sense, the Zetherian lead filed a formal complaint. By the 10th time, he started asking how humans knew when to break the rules. The work was dangerous and exhausting, and pushed both species to their limits. A human crew led by engineer Frank Mitchell worked 40 hours straight to repair a critical relay station when the scheduled replacement parts turned out to be the wrong size. They fabricated new parts on site using materials that were not rated for the application, but would probably work long enough. The repair held and the project stayed on schedule. The Zetherian observer asked Mitchell how he knew the improvised parts would work. Mitchell said he did not know for certain, but sitting around waiting for the right parts was guaranteed. Failure, so trying something was better than trying nothing. Month 3 of construction brought the first major crisis. A solar flare damaged 6 tether stations simultaneously and threatened to collapse the entire network. The mathematical models said repairs would take 2 weeks minimum. The project timeline said they had 4 days before the window closed, and the cosmic anomaly would be past the point of possible deflection. The Zetherian project managers began calculating resource losses and discussing how to salvage what they could from the failed attempt. The human teams had a different response. Engineer Bobby Chen organized every available crew into rapid response units. They would attempt all 6 repairs simultaneously, using whatever resources they could move into position fast enough. The Zetherian manager said the math showed it was impossible. Chen said the math had been wrong before and they should try anyway. President Sullivan authorized the use of every available spacecraft. The Zetherian Empire reluctantly agreed to support the attempt. The repairs became a race against time and physics. Human crews worked in conditions that safety regulations said were unsuitable. They made decisions in seconds that should have required hours of analysis. They improvised solutions using whatever materials were on hand. Zetherian crews watched and learned and started making their own decisions without waiting for approval from headquarters. The cultural barriers began breaking down when both species realized they shared the same goal and the same deadline. 3 days and 22 hours after the solar flare, all 6 stations came back online. The repairs were not pretty and would never pass a formal inspection, but they worked. The project was back on schedule with 2 hours to spare. The Zetherian project managers asked for a detailed report on how the humans had achieved the impossible. The human team leaders said they had just kept working until it was done, and there was not really a detailed process to report. The concept of succeeding through pure determination, without a formal methodology, disturbed the Zetherian understanding of how projects should work. The gravity tether network activated on schedule. 8 months after construction began, the combined human and Zetherian teams watched as the system came online and began redirecting the cosmic anomaly. The initial readings were good. The math predicted a 70% deflection, which would be enough to save the threatened worlds. Then something unexpected happened and the deflection jumped to 92%. The network was working better than the best-case projections. Physicist Gregory Bennett and his Zetherian counterpart Thalrex analyzed the data, trying to understand why the system exceeded expectations. They discovered that human improvisation during construction had accidentally created resonance patterns that improved efficiency. The deviations from the official plans had made the network better. Thalrex admitted that if Zetherian engineers had built the network alone, following proper procedures, it would have achieved maybe 60% deflection. The human willingness to break rules and try untested ideas had saved billions of lives. The success of the Gravity Tether project changed the relationship between humans and Zetherians permanently. The Empire formally ended the state of war and proposed a mutual alliance. President Sullivan agreed on the condition that the alliance be between equals and not a hierarchy. The Zetherian Council debated this for weeks because their entire culture was built on hierarchical relationships. Eventually they agreed because the alternative was losing access to human innovation and problem-solving abilities. The Terran Alliance was formed with representation from both Earth nations and Zetherian colony worlds. Ambassador Andrew Foster became the first human to address the Zetherian Council chambers. He proposed a simple framework for cooperation. Humans would provide workers and innovation and flexible thinking. Zetherians would provide advanced technology and long-term planning and resource management. Both species would benefit from what the other did well. The Council approved the proposal, and the galaxy gained its first truly cooperative multi-species alliance. The cultural exchange accelerated rapidly. Human workers began taking contracts in Zetherian space with fair wages and reasonable schedules, and the option to return home. Zetherian efficiency experts came to Earth and were horrified by human workplace safety standards, but impressed by human productivity. A Zetherian advisor named Kelvus spent 3 months studying a human factory and wrote a report that became required reading in the Empire. His main conclusion was that humans achieved high output not despite their chaotic methods, but because of them. Dr. Helen Park established the first joint medical school where human and Zetherian physicians could learn from each other. The Zetherian students struggled with the human concept of bedside manner. The human students struggled with Zetherian diagnostic precision. Both groups became better doctors by combining approaches. Park's graduates began spreading throughout both civilizations, bringing improved medical care that cut mortality rates across dozens of worlds. The economic integration created opportunities neither species had anticipated. Human entrepreneurs started businesses in Zetherian space offering services the aliens had never considered. A human named Victor Hayes opened a restaurant on a Zetherian trade station, serving food from both cultures. The Zetherians were skeptical until they tried coffee and discovered that the human beverage actually helped them stay alert during their long work cycles. Coffee imports became one of the largest trade goods moving between human and Zetherian space. The military cooperation evolved more slowly because trust took time to build. Joint patrol units started operating in border regions where both species had interests. A human captain named Jennifer Cole commanded a mixed crew on a border patrol ship. She reported that the biggest challenge was getting Zetherian officers to make decisions without checking with headquarters first. The biggest advantage was that Zetherian tactical analysis combined with human improvisation made the crew incredibly effective. Pirates and raiders learned quickly that mixed human-Zetherian patrols were not worth engaging. 2 years after the end of the war, Commander Vex Thor accepted a position as Zetherian ambassador to Earth. He met with Admiral Lisa Chang at a ceremony commemorating the alliance. They stood on the rebuilt Singapore Memorial, where Peter Wong's impossible shield had bought 17 minutes for thousands of lives. Vex Thor admitted that the Empire had made a terrible mistake in trying to conquer humanity. Chang said that mistakes were how both species learned, and the important thing was what came after. Vex Thor asked Chang what she thought humans and Zetherians could achieve together. Chang smiled and said they were just getting started. The galaxy was full of problems that needed solving, and apparently humans were very good at not quitting until problems were solved. Vex Thor said the Zetherians could provide the planning and resources for long-term projects. Together they could accomplish things neither species could do alone. The conversation turned to the future and the challenges both civilizations faced. There were other species in the galaxy struggling with problems similar to what the Zetherians had faced. There were resources to manage and territories to explore, and scientific mysteries to solve. The Alliance gave both species capabilities they had lacked alone. Zetherian patience and planning combined with human creativity and determination created something new in galactic politics. Chang proposed a toast using coffee, which had become popular among Zetherians who worked with humans. She raised her cup and said, "Here is to never giving up and always trying one more time." Vex Thor raised his cup and added, "Here's to learning that the best victories come from cooperation, not conquest." They drank and looked out at the city rebuilding around them. The memorial inscription was written in both human languages and Zetherian script. It read simply that on this site, both species learned that the strongest force in the universe is not weapons or technology, but the refusal to accept defeat. The Zetherians had learned that humans do not have an off button and cannot be made to quit. The humans had learned that even former enemies can become allies when they find common ground. Both species learned that sometimes the best solution to conflict is to stop fighting and start talking. The galaxy continued turning, and both civilizations moved forward together. The Terran Alliance became a model for cooperation between species. Other civilizations watched and learned. Some asked to join. Some remained skeptical. The humans and Zetherians did not worry much about skeptics, because they were too busy building things and solving problems and exploring possibilities. Years later, when other species asked what humans were, really, like the Zetherians always gave the same answer. Humans are relentless and creative and will try anything at least once. They do not know when to quit, which makes them terrifying enemies and invaluable friends. If you want something impossible done, find a human and give them coffee, and point them at the problem. Then get out of their way and watch them work miracles through sheer stubborn determination. The galaxy learned this lesson and it changed everything.